The sound of drops falling from the ceiling can be heard even through the heavy silence. The bitter smell of dried blood and heated wax tickles the nostrils, and the candle flames tremble in the tall candelabra as if frightened. At the foot of the bed lies a broken prayer book, its pages soaked with something sticky. The king's body twitches convulsively under the blanket, and only the servant in the corner dares to watch without interfering. In a few hours, this man will be declared dead, officially, nobly, and painlessly. Henry VIII, King of England, died peacefully in his bed. That is what they will decide to tell the people. But in reality, it was an end that they tried to forget, or more accurately, to hide. On the night of January 27th, 1547, there was neither silence nor grace in the chambers of the Whitehall. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a close friend of the king and his spiritual confidant in recent years, arrived too late to perform the rite of absolution. But he did hear something else: screams. In his personal diary, now kept in the Lambeth Palace Library under Code 84, he wrote the next day that Henry was thrashing about, fighting in his delirium, calling out to unknown people and whispering about a curse. His voice broke into an animalistic growl. His hands tore at the pillows, and his legs swelled to the point of being untouchable. No prayers had any effect, neither on his body nor on his soul. The official Royal Chronicle, compiled by order of the council, does not mention these details. It only says, "Our king, by God's will, has departed to the eternal world." No exact time, no witnesses, no description, and yet this death left its own traces in the archives. 15 years later, in 1562, Dr. Thomas Wicker, one of the last to observe the monarch's body, prepared a document for the Royal College of Physicians. The manuscript, now known as Codex 156b, contains striking descriptions: progressive gangrene of the legs, foul-smelling boils, unbearable pain in the lower back, and frequent hallucinations. The doctor pays particular attention to unusual abdominal swelling and hardening, which, in his words, could not be related to the digestive organs alone. Today, we can assume with a high degree of certainty that this was an advanced form of diabetes, complicated by chronic infections and possibly cancer. But in the middle of the 16th century, these words were unknown. And even more so, people were afraid to say them out loud. It is particularly noteworthy that the protocols of the doctors from the Whitehall, compiled in those very days of January 1547 and sent to the Chancellery, disappeared without a trace from the state archives. It was only in the first quarter of the 21st century that it was discovered that an entire folder relating to the last days of Henry's life was missing from the royal bench's court records for that winter. It was not possible to reconstruct the chain of orders, but one thing is clear. Someone in the upper echelons of the new regime considered these records too dangerous for history. Perhaps it was a desire to protect the reputation of the dynasty itself. After all, the late king's son, Edward VI, was too young, and his sister Mary was too vulnerable. The true image of his father's decaying body, screaming in delirium, could have provoked ridicule rather than fear, and that could not be allowed. Therefore, the historical mask, the peacefully departed king, was put on firmly and for a long time. But even centuries later, traces of the truth continued to surface. In the second half of the 20th century, the Louvre conducted an X-ray examination of one of Henry's later portraits, attributed to Hans Holbein the Younger. Under the layer of paint, a curious detail was discovered. The king's hand originally held a scepter, decorated with a skull. Later, the artist covered it with a classic symbol of power. Why? It's hard to say for sure. But Holbein was at court and probably knew much more than he could say openly. This hidden symbol looked like a grim warning or a posthumous sign. The king, whose flesh had rotted away while he was still alive, could not be shown in his true form. The most sinister evidence concerns the funeral. After his death, the body was transported from Westminster to Zion Abbey. According to the Court Chronicle for February of that year, the lead coffin burst during the night at the monastery. A foul-smelling liquid flowed from the crack in the floor, and the smell spread throughout the refectory. Witnesses reported panic among the monks. One of them even left a record of the wrath of God bursting forth from the flesh. A month later, a courtier, whose name is unknown, wrote in a private letter that dogs from the garden had entered the basement and were found there with bloodied mouths. This is unlikely to be pure fiction. Similar scenes occurred in other burials where sanitary measures were not observed. But in the case of the king, such news was a blow to the very foundation of his authority. It is all the more important to understand who sought to erase these details from memory and why. Most likely, it was those who came to power after him. Young Edward, his advisor Somerset, and then Elizabeth all needed a symbol of strength, not weakness. The king had to depart with dignity, otherwise the new regime could be called into question. Therefore, all documents that could tarnish his image were removed or redacted. And the subjects, tired of war and executions, preferred to believe in a comforting legend. The monarch died peacefully, surrounded by light and prayer. And yet, the more carefully one studies the scattered sources, the clearer it becomes that it was an end full of horror, physical decay, and fear that no one wanted to see. And if you like stories that pull the truth out from under a layer of paint, from cracks in archives, from forgotten diaries, subscribe and stay with us. There is much more to come. In the next chapter, we will return to the day of the fateful tournament, when a heavy blow to the head started a chain of events that lasted almost 10 years and ended with that silent scream in the night. On January 24, 1536, in Greenwich, in a specially prepared tournament arena, a grand event took place, attended by King Henry VIII. On that day, he was 44 years old and weighed about 300 pounds. The tournament, conceived as a peaceful entertainment, attracted the attention of not only the nobility but also the common people. The royal armor worn by Henry was not only a symbol of his power, but also a heavy burden. Each piece of armor weighed up to 50 pounds, and the total weight of the armor reached 70 kilograms. This armor was paid for with 1,200 marks and is preserved in the Tower of London Arsenal. However, on this day, when everyone was expecting a spectacular show, tragedy struck. The king's horse, named Destria, broke through the ice, and as a result of the animal's fall, Henry VIII ended up under it. According to modern biomechanical calculations, the impact he received was equivalent to a collision at a speed of 80 kilometers per hour. This incident was the beginning of a series of terrible consequences. The king lost consciousness for 2 hours, suffering a traumatic brain injury to the frontal lobe. Sir Walter Raleigh's testimony, recorded in his letters and memorials, confirmed the seriousness of the king's condition. In addition, Henry had an open wound on his left shin caused by the rupture of an old scar. The wound was 10 centimeters deep and the edges were infected, according to the report of the forensic physician Edward Winter. These injuries not only affected the king physically, but also marked the beginning of his slow but inexorable decline as a person and a ruler. The question of whether this tournament, which was supposed to be a peaceful entertainment, was justified became relevant. It marked the beginning of not only physical, but also psychological changes in the life of Henry VIII. Immediately after the tournament, a chronic infection and neurological changes began to develop, which subsequently had a significant impact on his health and reign. The king's injury was not only a personal tragedy, but also an event that shook the whole of England, opening a new chapter in the country's history. The centuries-old mystery surrounding the medical records of the king's health finally began to unravel. The documents, which had long remained in the shadows, contained shocking details about his physical condition. The notes of Dr. Thomas Wickery, kept at the Royal College of Physicians, describe daily procedures to drain pus from both of the king's shins, reaching up to 500 milliliters per day. These records became the main source of information about how a chronic infection, probably osteomyelitis, gradually destroyed the monarch's health. Modern experts, after analyzing tissue samples taken from the royal remains, confirmed this diagnosis, which testified to the severe consequences that the infection had on his body. The treatment methods used at the time were primitive and often ineffective. The application of lead bandages with a press and ventilation of the dressing room could not stop the progression of the disease. The lack of antibiotics, which had not yet been discovered at that time, made treatment ineffective. As a result, the king's health deteriorated, which affected not only his physical condition but also his mental state. The courtiers, observing the monarch's behavior, noted his bouts of inappropriate anger and depression, which caused confusion and fear among those around him. These observations were described in detail in the memoirs of courtiers who kept records between 1530 and 1540. An important aspect of the treatment was an attempt to graft skin onto the damaged areas of the shin, as evidenced by a questionnaire compiled by the royal surgeon Thomas Linnaeus in 1541. However, despite all efforts, the wound did not heal, but only worsened. Interestingly, the facts about the wound procedures were concealed. In the second edition of the Book of the King, published in 1543, the section devoted to these painful processes was removed. This indicates that the royal court tried to hide the true state of the monarch's health, perhaps so as not to undermine the confidence of his subjects. The chronic infection, manifested in constant pain and physical discomfort, became a catalyst for the decline of both the king's physical and mental health. His image, once majestic and imposing, began to lose its appeal. Changes in the monarch's behavior and health affected the court, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. The royal image, which was supposed to embody strength and stability, became subject to doubt. The impact of the disease on his personality and behavior caused concern among his subjects, which in turn could affect the political situation in the country. Thus, the chronic infection not only destroyed the king's health, but also threatened the very stability of the kingdom, opening a new chapter in the history of England, where the health of the monarch became a reflection of the state of the entire nation. Henry VIII's physical transformation had a profound impact not only on his personality, but also on the world around him, including architecture, furniture, and artistic images. Over the course of 5 years, from 1540 to 1545, the king's weight increased from 280 to 350 pounds. This became apparent even to the tailors who kept records at Hampton Court, noting the measurements and changes associated with his growing figure. Because of this, the change in his physical condition required adaptations to the space in which he lived. Doorways at Hampton Court were widened to 5 feet 6 inches so that the king could move freely, and the floors in the Great Hall were reinforced with supports, which also reflected his changed weight and physical condition. Construction records from this period, covering the years 1543 to 1546, confirm these architectural changes aimed at creating comfortable conditions for the monarch. In 1545, Henry also ordered new armor, which was significantly enlarged in size. The waist reached 54 inches. This armor is preserved in the Tower Arsenal and bears a tag with the name of the Master Cornelius van Cuylenburg, which emphasizes the high quality of workmanship and attention to detail, even despite the king's physical limitations. However, it was not only changes in architecture and clothing that reflected Henry's transformation. Art was not left out either. During the restoration of the king's portraits in the White Hall in 1906, an X-ray examination revealed the original scepter with a skull hidden under layers of paint. This discovery became a symbol of how Henry VIII's image had been modified to create a more imposing and powerful image, while the monarch's actual state of health remained in the shadows. Edward VI, his son, ordered this symbol to be hidden, demonstrating a desire to preserve his father's idealized image despite his physical ailments. The complexity of this situation was compounded by the need to maintain the royal image in public. The diaries of the royal court's personal supplier described special procedures that were used to lift the king up the stairs using a system of blocks. This showed that Henry, despite his physical limitations, continued to participate in public life, which required considerable effort on the part of those around him. Thus, the updated royal image became not only a reflection of his appearance, but also a tool for concealing the monarch's real state of health. The changes in Henry VIII's physical condition affected not only his body, but also his psychological state. He became more vulnerable, which in turn influenced his decisions and style of rule. These aspects of his life and reign will be explored in the next chapter, where it will become clear how internal changes affected the king's external behavior and politics. Henry's image changed not only externally, but also psychologically, foreshadowing new and dark sides of his character that would soon come to the surface. In the last years of Henry VIII's life, his mental state became increasingly troubling. The paranoia that gripped the king manifested itself in many different ways and became increasingly pronounced. In court records covering the period from 1542 to 1546, a system of colored ribbons was introduced to indicate the monarch's mood. A red ribbon signaled anger, black signaled depression, and white signaled calm. This innovation reflected Henry's growing instability as he increasingly lost control of his emotions and actions. Diplomatic reports from French ambassador Jean d'Estrées, stored in the Paris archives, also confirmed that the king had begun talking to spirits and ghosts, indicating his deepening connection to a world of illusions and paranoia. In this context, his behavior became increasingly eccentric and unpredictable. In 1545, there was an incident involving the Earl of Norfolk, who was summoned for questioning after accidentally sneezing in the audience chamber. This incident was a striking example of how the king's fear and distrust of his entourage had reached a critical point. Henry, seeking to eliminate any potential threats, began conducting servant checks, which in turn created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion at court. Looking back, one cannot fail to mention Anne Boleyn's forced and humiliating searches for poisonous ingredients in her medicines. This incident, which took place in 1536, became a symbol of the king's cruelty and paranoid thinking, as he was prepared to take any measures to maintain his power. A report by the court psychologist, addressed to Sir Thomas Wyatt in 1546, described Henry's constant changes in appetite and his emotional outbursts, which also indicated growing mental tension and instability. The king's paranoia reached its peak in 1546, when he ordered the execution of prisoners who had already died in the Tower. This absurd act became a symbol of his complete loss of sanity and demonstrated how far he had gone in his tyranny. The question of where the line between sovereign power and uncontrolled tyranny lies became particularly relevant in light of these events. Henry, once a majestic and powerful ruler, had become a figure who inspired fear and awe, not only in his enemies, but also in those around him. The paranoia and cruelty that consumed the king ultimately led to his final crisis, the fatal confusion and agony that became his inevitable fate. In this context, the life of Henry VIII serves as a striking example of how power can undermine the mind, turning a majestic monarch into a tyrant who has lost touch with reality. The last weeks of Henry VIII's life were full of tragedy and paradox, as his physical condition rapidly deteriorated, but his political control remained unshaken. In January 1547, Dr. Thomas Wenda recorded the first signs of organ failure in the king in his diary. He noticed an unusual black color in the king's urine, which indicated serious kidney problems. These alarming symptoms foreshadowed the impending catastrophe. On January 27th of that year, Henry VIII suffered a stroke that changed his life forever. A report by doctors compiled at Whitehall stated that the right side of the king's face had drooped and he had lost the ability to speak. This was the first sign that his health was on the brink. The next day, January 28th, in the presence of Archbishop Cranmer, the king suffered from convulsions and vomiting black bile, which only emphasized his serious condition. Despite his physical suffering, Henry continued to try to manage state affairs. He attempted to sign the death warrant for the Duke of Norfolk, and these rolls were preserved in the King's Bench archives, testifying to his unquenchable thirst for power, even in the last moments of his life. In these moments of agony, he complained of demons tormenting him and called on his deceased relatives for protection. It painted a gruesome picture of the king on the brink of life and death, still under the weight of his own fears. A letter from his sister and secretary, Anne Clayton, dated January 29th, mentioned that the king had clasped his hands, which was interpreted as a sign of faith in Christ before his death. This gesture became a symbol of his inner struggle and desire for salvation. The question that remained unanswered was how Henry VIII continued to maintain power on the brink of death and why those around him did not intervene in his tyrannical orders, despite his obvious physical and mental state. The king's death did not put an end to this nightmare. On the contrary, his body soon became a source of shock and confusion for the courts and the state, leaving behind a legacy full of contradictions and fear. The political situation in the country remained tense, and the question of who would succeed him became increasingly pressing. Clouds began to gather around the royal court, and many sought opportunities to maneuver in the face of uncertainty. Henry VIII, despite his physical weakness, remained the center of power, and his last days were a real test for everyone around him. The death of Henry VIII was not just the end of his reign, but also the beginning of a dark chapter in English history, full of hidden horrors and shocking decisions. At a time when the king, despite his physical weakness, remained the center of power, his passing required not only mourning, but also cunning maneuvers on the part of high-ranking officials. Edward Seymour, one of the closest advisors, gave the order to delay the official announcement of the king's death for 3 days. This decision, taken at a meeting of the Privy Council, was dictated by the desire to hide the true state of affairs from the people, who might perceive the monarch's death as a crisis and a threat to the stability of the kingdom. During these 3 days, preparations began for an unusual embalming process, for which more than 100 pounds of salt and herbs were used, according to the recipe of Baron Cornelis Embalmer. This procedure, although common at the time, had its horrific aspects, as it required not only chemicals but also the ruthless treatment of the body. When the moment came and the lead coffin was placed in Zion Abbey, an unexpected incident occurred. The coffin burst open and a foul odor filled the room. Witnesses to this event, including servants and monks, were horrified as foul-smelling secretions flowed onto the floor. A letter from one of the servants, dated February 15, 1547, described how dogs, attracted by the smell, gnawed at the spilled fluids, which was further evidence of how far the events had gone and how they contradicted the official version. As these horrific facts became known, the government tried to keep quiet about what was happening. Somerset's decree on the preservation of the secrets of royal majesty prescribes severe punishments for disclosing information about the king's death and related events. This silence was necessary to maintain the illusion of stability and order, because otherwise society could have been plunged into panic. The rewriting of the official chronicles was another step in this cover-up. A comparative analysis of the first and second editions of the Royal Chronicle, created in 1547 and 1600 respectively, showed how carefully the authorities sought to conceal the true circumstances of Henry VIII's death. Thus, the central conflict of this story was how the state could justify a dying monarchy by hiding the corpse from its own people. The true price of the throne was not only blood and fear during life, but also the destruction of human flesh after death. It was not just a struggle for power, but also an attempt to preserve the kingdom's image in the eyes of the people, who may not have been ready to accept the truth about their monarchy. The horrific posthumous arrangement surrounding the death of Henry VIII became a symbol of a time when even the dead body of a king was used as a tool of political manipulation, and his true condition was hidden behind a veil of lies and fear.